Okay, I think we should make a start. So, a very warm welcome to everyone from myself, Ed Turner, and from the Foreign Policy Centre and the Aston Centre for Europe to this event. The idea was to have the opportunity for a lively, free-flowing discussion on the outcome of the European elections and what they mean for Europe, what they mean for the European Union. Those of us based in the United Kingdom will be particularly interested in any lessons there. And certainly in terms of talking points, these elections have not disappointed, and we could be thinking about some really quite far-reaching impacts. We've got a wonderful panel of questions, but I've also noticed who's joining, and we've got some great expertise in the audience as well. So I'll briefly introduce those involved, and then we'll pass over for some short contributions from each of our contributors. There's also a question and answer function. If you've got a burning question that you'd like to kind of put down, then I think you can do so immediately. But other than that, we'll open up Q&A afterwards, and there'll be ample opportunity for that. The Foreign Policy Centre is a leading think tank covering issues across the globe, with a particularly sharp focus, for example, on human rights and press freedom. Aston University, the Aston Centre for Europe, has a long-standing partnership and friendship with the FPC. We've had many great discussions in the flesh and online, and are really, really pleased with that partnership. And yeah, it's in that context that we're meeting today. We're going to be joined by three people who actually all rather wonderfully have a connection to Aston University in different ways. Our first speaker will be Johannes Lindner. Johannes is an honorary professor at Aston University, but his main role is as director of the Jacques Delors Centre think tank in Berlin, which is part of the Hertie School of Governance, and he's on secondment from the European Central Bank, where he used to head the division which looked after the relations of the ECB with other European institutions. So Johannes has a really deep insider knowledge of the EU, but also a critical distance to it these days. Sofia Vasilopoulou is Professor of European Politics at King's College London. She is the sort of scholar where you look at her CV and think, does she eat? Does she sleep? She's published very, very widely, particularly on issues including Euroscepticism and the far right. And so I know that she'll have a lot of interesting reflections to share on the results that we've just seen. David Harley has actually been a long-standing friend to Aston as well. David's a former Deputy General Secretary of the European Parliament, as well as being a member of the Advisory Council of the Foreign Policy Centre. He was an EU diplomat. He's also published both his political diaries and more recently an edited volume about British MEPs between 1979 and 2020. And again, someone who can provide both critical distance, but also a real insider view. So colleagues, I'll pass the floor to each of you individually, if I may, starting with Johannes, and then we'll have, I think, a really good amount of time for questions. Thank you all. Johannes, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ed. Thank you very much also to the Foreign Policy Centre for the invitations. Great to be here. I want to make very briefly 4 points to set the scene. First is that the results are largely within the expected. So we do have a shift to the right, but the sort of pro-European majority has held. The pro-European majority of S&D, EPP, and the Liberals. There have been losses with the Liberals and the Greens, and there is certainly, as I said, at the right fringes, an extreme right, and also a couple of quite a high number of MEPs not yet associated to a group that we see as part of the result. Now, this formation process is now going on, so that we may see still a slight adjustment in terms of who is the third largest group. There may still the question of how the extreme right is kind of positioning itself in terms of 1, 2, or 3 groups. That is very relevant for the internal politics of the parliament, for who gets which committees, who is sort of what's the relative strength of the individual groups. But I do expect that the sort of dominating coalition will be largely formed by the three parties that I mentioned. The EPP will play an important role because the EPP will have the opportunity, especially if the ECR is sort of distancing itself to the extreme right players in the parliament. The ECR will want to be a possible partner in a coalition, and it will be very interesting to what extent during the legislature there could be kind of a more of an involvement of the conservatives, the European conservative group, together with the EPP. And of course, it will be interesting to what extent that is possible without losing the Liberals and the SND as part of this sort of pro-European coalition. So these are the first 2 points. My third point is that this was a European Parliament election, but it was also de facto 27 national elections with very specific national dynamics. And of course, here from Berlin, we look particularly on the dynamics of what happened in Paris and the extremely high percentages that the Rassemblement National, the extreme right, got in Paris, and the reaction of President Macron to call elections for the Assemblée Nationale. And also here in Germany, it was clearly a protest vote against the acting traffic coalition, with high results for the AfD, in particular in the east of Germany. And also a new populist left-wing party, the Sarah Wagenknecht. So I would say that this means that one of the channels of influence from this European Parliament election goes via the Council. And we will see that I would expect less leadership of Germany and France in pushing forward an ambitious European agenda. And it will be interesting to see how this sort of leadership vacuum, or this lack of leadership by Germany and France, which anyway wasn't the strongest engine at the moment between Macron and Scholz, how this will be filled. And my expectation, and to a certain extent from a normative perspective, hope, given the challenges that Europe faces, is that the Commission will have will take up these challenges, and that we'll have a Commission team and a Commission agenda that carries through the 5 years. So my expectation, that's my last point, is that von der Leyen will be nominated by the Council. Hasn't happened on Monday, but I think it will happen at the end of the month at the formal European Council, and that she will get a majority. It's then interesting to see to what extent she also needs to bring in the Greens for that vote of becoming the acting Commission President. And then I hope that there will be a process where she can assemble a strong team, and where we'll then see that also the hearings with the commissioners the Parliament will have a bit of influence for commitments to a strong sort of European agenda. Taking into account that this is a parliament that has shifted to the right, and even the EPP before the election has sort of shifted to the right. So it will be an agenda that will be focusing more on security, more on competitiveness, and less on climate. But I don't expect a rollback on climate, but I'm sure we'll come back to this in the discussion.
Johannes, thank you ever so much. That's really, really interesting, and lots of things we can pick up in discussion there. Sofia, let's pass to you.
Yes, thank you very much again for the invitation to both Ed and Aston University, but also the Foreign Policy Center. I'm delighted to be here, and I think what I will be saying kind of follows nicely from Johannes and the previous speaker. I'm going to just give a little bit of an overview on the European electoral results, primarily from the perspective of the far right, the party family I'm specializing in. So I will briefly talk a little bit about the electoral patterns in these European elections. Then I will just give you some brief thoughts on voting behavior, why people opted for these parties, and a couple of thoughts on some potential political implications. Now, let's start with electoral patterns. Now, the key question that everybody was asking the past few months was, will the center hold? And what we've seen is that, yes, the center holds at the moment. So the European People's Party is still the first largest group, followed by the Social Democrats as the second largest. And Renew Europe appears to be probably the fourth group, but of course there might be some changes. At the same time, it's equally true to say that the median voter has moved to the right. So there has also been a rightward shift. So both statements are simultaneously correct. The center holds, but there has also been a rightward shift. Now, there has been fragmentation on the left and on the right, and I want to briefly discuss fragmentation on the right. And when I talk about the right, I mean the far right. So not the European People's Party, but what happens to the right of the European People's Party. Because we tend to hear a little bit less about that. So first of all, the far right has at the moment two European Parliament groups, that is so they organize in two different European Parliament groups, the ECR and Identity and Democracy. And there is a third group of non-attached individuals or MEPs, who are primarily from far-right groups. And within that, it's very important to make the point that when we are talking about the far right, this is a kind of a very big umbrella term that encompasses a wide variety of different actors. And it might be helpful to kind of break down these actors into, on the one hand, the radical right, so political parties that essentially are critical towards the liberal aspects of democracy, for example, different types of rights, and differentiating them from the extreme right wing within that general umbrella group, where we see parties that are much more, they're definitely against, much more vocally against the liberal aspects of democracy, but they are often against procedural aspects of democracy as well. Now, when it comes to the results, we have seen quite a lot of variation in terms of gains. Overall, we can say that most political parties improved their electoral results compared to 2019. Very few lost. I'm thinking about Finland, Denmark, and Sweden. We saw a slight drop in the far-right parties in these countries. But really, we have seen four big winners. So the first big winner was Austria. And that's quite interesting because the FPO did really well, and there is going to be an election in Austria in the next few months. So it would be interesting to see how that might play out. Another very important winner has been the Rassemblement National in France, and potentially one of the greatest winners because they increased their percentage from about 23% in the previous election to about 31% now. Then we've got Fidesz in Hungary, again a winner with 44% of the vote. Having said that, actually, Fidesz lost about 9 percentage points compared to the previous election. So still a first party with a very sizable majority of the vote, but actually lost compared to the previous elections. And then I want to briefly talk about Italy. And Italy is an important case because this is really where we are zooming in on in the next few weeks. And the brothers of Italy of Giorgia Meloni did really well. They did almost 29% of the vote. They improved dramatically compared to the previous electoral results. That being said, if you look at Italy as a whole, the right-wing vote stayed about the same because the vote for the League dropped dramatically. So essentially what we've seen in Italy is a bit of a reshuffling of the votes. So that's pretty much kind of an overview of what happened in terms of results. Now, does that matter? It does matter to a large extent because we shouldn't forget that there is quite a lot of variation within the far right. I talked about the radicals and the extremes, but there's also variation in terms of how pro-European they are, how pro-Russian they are. Of course, we have the AfD, which is closer to the extreme variant of the far right, where we have heard about remarks about the role of the SS, plans to deport migrants, and so on. And then on the other hand, you brothers of Italy of Giorgia Meloni have a much more pro-European, in comparison, pro-NATO, pro-Atlanticist view. Now, a couple of thoughts on the causes, okay? So what happened? Why people are opting for such parties? And here there are a multitude of causes, so it's really hard to pin down to just one. But it's worth pointing out that there is quite a lot of frustration with politics, quite a lot of political disillusionment, lack of trust in institutions, lack of trust in political parties that drives these kinds of votes. And even more in the European Parliament elections, which tend to be regarded as second-order elections, elections that are not as important as national elections. But we shouldn't forget that we live in an era of cost of living crisis, the Ukraine war, and so on. So these issues have also played a big part, and quite a lot of voters of these parties have quoted economic reasons for opting for these parties, such as addressing issues of inflation. And of course, immigration, which is the issue which is the primary issue of the far right, is also playing a great role. Here, though, we should say that immigration, to some extent, has reached its potential, has reached a payoff ceiling when it comes to far right parties. And what we are seeing is that they are changing their agenda to also incorporating other kind of moral values in their discourse. So questions about same-sex marriage, gay rights, and so on and so forth. So my third point here is, does that actually matter? All these changes, do they actually matter? Now, questions that we've been thinking about is the European Parliament going to be more pro-Russian? Well, the answer to that is yes and no, in the sense that the pro-Russian far-right forces were already in the European Parliament in the previous election, and we should really not forget that there is a great deal of variation within this party family when it comes to their views on Russia. Will the next parliament be less green? Will that be a risk to the European Green Deal? It's possible, actually, because a lot of these far-right parties are trying to use the environment as a wedge issue across political parties. However, we should say that members of the European Parliament from these parties generally tend to be less disciplined in following the party line, and quite often are less likely to turn up to do their parliamentary work in the European Parliament. The last point I want to make within that is what we should be looking at is the power balance in the European Parliament. And I agree with Johannes in terms of essentially the center holding, and potentially there's no kind of opening out to the far right. Having said that, Ursula von der Leyen has talked about being ready to work with forces that respect her three red lines, being pro-European, pro-Ukraine, and respecting the rule of law. And of course, Meloni, this is the primary person or political party is looking out towards, certainly ticks the box in terms of being pro-European and pro-Ukraine. Of course, there might be doubts about respecting the rule of law, but I think I might just leave that as open to our discussion later. So thank you very much.
Sofia, thanks very much indeed for that really rich and thought-provoking presentation, and unpacking, in particular, the far-right family for us. Really useful. David, what does all this mean in your experience as a very seasoned EU watcher? Really look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you. Well, it's been very interesting hearing the insights of the other people on the panel. I feel there's a touch of the Lampedusas in all this talk about the centre holding. Yes, you can say, as Ursula von der Leyen did on the night of the elections, that the centre was holding, but it's only holding because the centre of gravity has moved to the right. And my reference to Lampedusa is that the famous saying by the prince that if things are going to change, they have to stay the same. And I think the EPP in particular are trying very hard to give the impression with other pro-EU groups that everything is fine and dandy. But actually, and this is my headline point, without wishing to sound too portentous, I believe following these elections, we are living a particularly dangerous moment for Europe and for the European Union. And I would like to reserve a couple of minutes at the end of my allotted time now to talk about France. I happened to be in France for a few days at the end of last week, and the sense of confusion and febrility was quite extraordinary, and will have an impact on every other aspect almost of the consequences of the elections that we're talking about today, but way into other spheres as well. Internally in the European Parliament, the EPP will have a very dominant role. Not only are they the largest group by a long way at the moment, but I feel almost certainly there'll be quite a lot of other of the non-attached members that will probably be joining the EPP. And of course, the difference between France and Germany in terms of these results is that even if the three parties in coalition in Berlin at the moment did very badly, relatively speaking, they are at least all pro-European. And so the EPP, under the chairmanship of the presidency of Manfred Weber, who's president not only of the group, but also of the party, and looking forward to how things may pan out in internal German politics, the EPP is in a very, very strong position. I just wonder if they're not playing a little bit of a double game, and I don't say that in a derogatory way at all, that the EPP need to get together a pro-EU majority to get in Mrs. von der Leyen. But later on, they may look at shifting alliances and may open up a bit to the ECR in particular, depending on the specific issues that are being debated and voted in the plenary. Also, I would point out that, as Sofia has said, the extreme right, far right groups don't have a great record in turning up, first of all, and secondly, in actually playing an active part in committee as part of the legislative process. So there may be a little bit of a dissonance between the overall numbers on the right and on the far right and the influence that these groups and individual members may have in committee. There probably will also be consequences in the other institutions, that this shift to the right, even if it's still a matter of the centre holding, will probably be reflected in the choice of national governments for commissioners. We've seen the first sort of turf war the other evening after dinner. Overnight, or since yesterday anyway, Mrs. Maloney has an additional 7 members at least for her group, so has replaced Renew as the third largest group, and she will certainly ask for an appropriate prize that reflects this new position. Then what will the socialists do if the EPP and the ECR start carving out jobs, and where does that leave the Liberals as well? And I thought it was perhaps a little bit premature, as it wasn't even an official meeting, for the leaks to the press to be made criticizing Antonio Costa for not having a sufficient command of English and being a bit weak on immigration. At national level, we've already discussed the implications, in particular for Germany and for Italy. Globally, this has not been a great set of results for the image of the European Union around the world, noted with delight in Moscow. The former President Medvedev said that these results reflected in part both leaders, referring to Scholz and Macron's inept policy of backing Ukraine. And he said, time to retire to the ash heap of history. So that was the comment coming out of Moscow. And the Rassemblement National's position on NATO, which apparently changed yesterday to be opposed to France being part of NATO's command structure, that is also something of concern for other NATO members. Now, a couple of words on the situation in France. It's difficult because it's such a constantly changing issue, but it looks as though the Rassemblement National at the moment is round about 34%. The new Popular Front on 28%. and Macron trailing in third position, around about 18%. But what I find rather extraordinary is that the program for government, first of all, for the Rassemblement National, doesn't exist. But if you look at their previous plans and proposals, they are very anti-EU. And one cannot rule out necessarily that there will be very severe frictions between France and the other member states and between France and the institutions. They have been very effective in the Rassemblement National of detoxifying the brand. But when it comes down to how they will deal, for example, with the warning on excessive deficits that came out of the Commission yesterday, it may well be that France, under a Le Pen presidency or a Bardella-led government, will not be able to, will not wish to maintain some of its traditional commitments, and may also, as has been rumoured, not pay their share of the EU budget, which would result in a major crisis. On the other hand, the Popular Front parties are hardly united in every respect, and a number of their proposals, which is also true of the Rassemblement National, either go against EU law or the French constitution. So it's very difficult to see a clear way forward, and let's hope that deals can be struck and common sense will prevail, and that the European Union will not end up in a major crisis following these results in France. Thank you.
David, terrific. Thanks very much indeed. So quickly to remind people, one question already in the chat, but participants don't, or rather in the Q&A function, speakers, you don't need to look at that. I'll kind of bowl questions to you from that, if that's okay. I was actually going to turn to Johannes to pick up quickly the theme of France, because that's obviously something we've all touched on. Clearly, the European Union's institutions are well used to dealing with governments with Eurosceptic agendas, sometimes those which challenge the premises of European integration. But I don't think they're used to the scale of challenge which might come from France after these elections. So could you maybe share a few reflections on how resilient or otherwise you think the EU might prove, how you think it would cope with a shift in the French government to far right? And I mean, maybe there are two stages to that. And the other question is then if there was a Le Pen presidency as well on top of that. If I pass the ball to you there.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I very much share what David said, and I think many of our counterparts in Paris were rather shocked by the decision of Macron and flabbergasted that he took that decision. Now, there are different theories on why he did it. Some people saying this was planned because he knew he wouldn't have a majority and support for a budget vote then later in autumn. But it strikes me there was also quite an amount of thinking that he can take it on themselves. And of course, also the view that the presidential election, so the election about his successor, are the key ones. So a mixture between hoping that he would maybe master a majority for his own party, and I think that dream is probably becoming ever less realistic from what we see from the results, also that David or the polls or the forecast that we see. And also the thought that if they were to gain power, then they would be distracting themselves so that they would be and mystified in a way. In Germany, we say entzaubert by the time that 27 comes. Both are quite heavy bets. And that's why I said quite a number of our counterparts were saying, like, why did he do that step? Now, on to your question. I mean, what will be the interaction within the European institutions? I think one element which is not yet so clear is how if we were to have a majority of RN and we would have a Bardella prime ministership and a government run by RN, that's not yet sure. The one other possible scenario is that we have actually a parliament that is divided between three blocks: Renew bloc, RN bloc, and the far left bloc. So, or the Front Populaire. So we don't know precisely how the election will pan out. But were we to have a Bardella government, what is not so clear also, because it's not, I mean, there is no kind of a clear written constitution that spells out all the intricacies, but how a cohabitation will work. So, I mean, it's clear that there is a foreign policy prerogative for the president, but what does that mean precisely? And in particular, if they are not both from a sort of more centrist party like we had under Chirac with Jospin, or with Mitterrand and Chirac. So how does that pan out is still very much open. And Macron probably hopes that he will be able to rein in if there were to be an RN government, but it's not so clear cut. I mean, think about who would propose the commissioner. And how would, I mean, it's clear that the ministers would be sitting in the in the EU Council, and these would be RN ministers. So what is the possibility also for the president in a way to keep constraints to that government? That's not so clear cut. And of course, one of the elements of how this pans out will be to see how quickly these two players would come together, the prime minister and the president, and find an equilibrium. Now, having said that, I think indeed the Commission will play an important role, and will want to kind of get some dialogue with the president, with the new government in place. And what is also very important is that come Monday, the 8th of July, there's communication beforehand, both from the central banks, from the Eurogroup, from the Commission, that there's a path, a controlled path of government foundation, and that we prevent market reaction and market speculation to hold or to come in. I think that's very important, that the communication around this sort of first reactions against the election results, if they were to be in the direction of an RN government, that this would be controlled, and that already Sunday evening or before the markets open on Monday, there is a clear path of communication towards it. But of course, that's particularly difficult if there is no clear election result. So a lot what I'm saying is more pointing out the difficulties and challenges rather than a clear path of what will happen, especially in last point, it's because it's not a country like Poland that's not part of the currency union, but it's a country that is in the currency union and is also one of the key big member states. So that is a new situation that we haven't had before.
Thanks, Johannes. David, Sofia, anything you want to add on France before we turn to the topic, which is aired in a couple of the questions?
Well, I agree with a lot of what Johannes has just said, and I find it a particularly important point that there should be sufficient preparation with monetary and financial institutions. And I'd be quite curious to hear from Johannes, if we can ask him again, as to what should the Rassemblement National do and say between now and the 8th of June so as not to frighten the markets. And the possibility, the scenario of RN not getting an overall majority in the parliament is, I think, perfectly realistic. They have to get 289 seats. And so the fact that there may be no clear overall majority for any one party is another sort of unique question, which we've never really had to deal with before. And another thing that struck me when I was in France the other day was the excessive language used, particularly by Macron, who I find has been very dismissive of some of the forces on the left, because the only way out for him, if there is no overall majority for the Rassemblement National, would be a deal between the Macronists and at least some of the Popular Front. Obviously, there is a sort of general willingness to exclude Mélenchon, which may be easier said than done. But I would have thought Macron needs to be a little bit more courteous and respectful to the parties on his left.
Thanks, David. Sofia, I'll bring you in a second, but there was a particular question to Johannes, if you have the opportunity to be a consultant to the Rassemblement National for a moment and how they should calm the markets.
No, exactly. My first point would be I would not want to be the advisor there, but I understand where you come from, David, with that particular kind of question. I mean, what will be interesting to see is that I think there is a question of, I mean, somebody, I heard somebody saying or using these two terms, which I thought was interesting in describing the strategies. One was the Melonization versus the urbanization. So Orban and Meloni as the two roots. I don't know. I mean, I hope you don't mind, Sophie, that I'm using these terms. You're much more the experts there. But what was interesting is to see, like, would they want to do a strategy? Would they want to pursue a strategy where, in particular, until the election and the second round, they are seen as rather careful on the economic side? They were sending a message like what Meloni did. We are serious. I mean, some of the indications in towards pension reforms and so on go in that direction to say, don't worry, international markets, don't worry. We are conservative, but we are not crazy, and so that could be this sort of Melonization kind of strategy that they may pursue. The urbanization would be one. I don't know whether that term really fits perfectly, but would be one, of course, where they are much closer to the voters and their expectation to take radical decisions straight away. And I think they will be treading or trying to find a balance between these two routes and not alienating some of their voters that want to have a real policy change. And at the same time, they know that they will be wanting to. They will be wanting to also not upset the markets and have the possibility to use these 2 years. And then I think that also plays to the point of, will they distract themselves or not? I mean, the problem of the cohabitation is that it's not so clear cut that Macron will be able to show that they are acting irresponsibly, because the cohabitation will allow them to say, if only we had the full power, we could do this and that. But given that there is cohabitation and still Macron as a president, there is a blame game that they could play that I find could be rather dangerous, and playing against that bet to say once they're in power, they will distract themselves. And then one last point to your second point, David, on the groups. Of course, what we have to distinguish between is the electoral system and the grouping that are done now for the electoral system. And mind you, the electoral system was designed to put the far right out, but it may work in another direction, because you have the system where it sort of encourages to do electoral groups. And once the elections are over, you have the parliamentary factions, and maybe there could be, and that may be a strategy that the Renew has, that there could be then a regrouping on the left, where then maybe parts, as you mentioned, parts of the left may then join a sort of more centrist group. But that's pure speculation. I just wanted to make this point that the electoral system is one which forces you to do groups, and then there's a different dynamics once we have the new Assemblée Nationale.
Thanks very much, Johannes. I'm going to turn to Sofia in a moment for any reflections on France, but also, Sofia, there are a couple of questions in the chat which I think you'd be really well placed to comment on. I mean, one is about why there might be a rising influence of European elections on national politics. So we often think about it the other way around, but particularly the question highlights France and Belgium. And then also a question about the view, you used the phrase second order elections, that these are protest votes. And I suppose a challenge to that, which I see quite a lot in the German context, is that there's been a propensity to say AfD support is a protest vote, but actually it feels more established. And of course, we'll have the opportunity with some state elections in Eastern Germany in the autumn to test that. But so if you've got any thoughts about France, great. If you've got any thoughts about the relationship between EP elections and national politics, and the fact they seem to be having an influence in that direction, and also on how they fit the pattern of sort of second order elections, protest voting. Then what I'm going to do, just so that they know, is I'm going to ask Johannes about EU foreign policy policy, and I'm going to ask David about EP stances on Chinese electric vehicles. Sofia, over to you.
Wow, thank you very much for all these questions. So let's start with the point about second order elections. So what does that mean? It means that generally on the whole, people tend to turn out less in second order elections. So turnout tends to be lower compared to national elections, and they tend to use them in order to punish the government. Have we seen that this time round? Yes, we have. And we've been seeing that for a long time. We have seen a bit of an increase of turnout. So actually, I think the turnout point depends on a country level. But have we seen government dissatisfaction with government and protest voting and so on? Yes, we have. Now, what is the interesting thing that we've seen this time around is that actually the European Parliament election results have triggered a national election, which is actually something fairly new when it comes to European elections. So in that sense, actually, we are seeing this as having an impact on national politics, that's what we discussed so far. Now, kind of thinking a little bit about these political parties and how they kind of politicize what we know. And I think I want to link that to the conversation we had about France. Now, far-right parties do not politicize questions of the economy. So actually, their winning card is not talk about economic issues and shift the agenda to more cultural issues. And this is why they've been talking about immigration. What that means in practice is that most of these parties have very, what we call blurry or blurred economic policies, right? So they don't have clarity on their economic policy. And I think that also applies to Rassemblement National. Actually, they have shifted quite a lot. 20 years ago, the argument was that they were neoliberal in terms of their economic policy. Now they have moved to the center, and actually some of them have moved much more towards the left. They're having very protectionist policies. So that's quite important when it comes to what might happen in the next few months or years in terms of France, because the Rassemblement National does not really have an economic policy package. I should say that Meloni had a much stronger economic policy package, and I think this is kind of the third point I want to make, because you talked about Melonization or urbanization, and to some extent I think this metaphor is quite interesting and quite useful, in the sense that actually we're still talking about the far right, but we are talking about different political parties. So on the one hand, the Brothers of Italy are descendants of a fascist party. However, over the last 20, 30 years, they have progressively become more mainstream in terms of their ideas. So I had the pleasure to actually have a case study in my PhD on Alleanza Nazionale, National Alliance, which is the precursor of the Brothers of Italy. And I included them in my PhD thesis because they were an example of a pro-European party within the far right. That was actually the point of including them. When I say pro-European, that doesn't mean, I don't mean pro-federalist, right? But certainly a party that was already willing to work with the European Union on various levels. Their leader, Gianfranco Fini, actually was involved in the European Convention. That's a long time ago for some of, perhaps some of us, yeah. Not a long time for others, or us that were working on it. So certainly one thing to say about Meloni and her party is that certainly when it comes to international issues, they have not really shifted. It is a kind of a progressive change towards kind of the middle ground, as it were. And again, this does not mean a federalist Europe, but meaning, you know, actually even using Europe in terms of addressing their own issues, questions about, you know, the southern borders of Europe, you know, facing Africa and so on and so forth. Now, when it comes to parties like Marine Le Pen's party, actually we have seen a change in the tone, so how they present themselves, how they frame their ideas, but in terms of policy, we have not really seen that much change. The party has been quite adversarial in its policies. In terms of the European Union, yes, they have softened their policy. They used to talk about Frexit quite clearly. The past few years, they haven't been talking about that. Of course, that could be related to the fact that Brexit has happened and somehow this has reverberated across the continent. But surely Marine Le Pen and her party is not offering the same kind of vision of Europe as Meloni is. And in that sense, having a Rassemblement National leadership in France might pose a greater threat to the European Union compared to Meloni. And I guess another point to make as a footnote here, in this sense, the strategy of the EPP and van der Leyen to look towards Meloni might be, I mean, it has a positive and a negative aspect, right? A negative aspect, it could be that actually sees mainstreamizing far-right ideas or some of the far-right ideas by potentially working with them. But the other, kind of another way of seeing that is actually she might manage to break the far-right into groups and actually eventually, you know, Marine Le Pen will even, you know, not be able to work with Meloni, or would really have to modify their positions in order to be accepted as part of the mainstream, which are not so far.
Thanks very much indeed. Johannes, there's a question in a chat about where this might leave European Union ambitions on foreign policy. Let me also put another comment which has just come in the Q&A to you as well. Question about the Europeanization of the campaign and the extent to which European issues played a role. You may have a sense of that, but also, I suppose, for people who are seeking to use the European Parliament to provide greater legitimacy to European decision-making, if you have this clump of second-order national elections electing politicians from outside the mainstream to the EP, then it's quite hard to make those claims. That would be a sort of challenge which would be advanced, and I'd be interested in your reflections on that. So foreign policy and then the legitimacy of the European Parliament. Take about 2.5 minutes on that, if you would.
Wow. Briefly on foreign policy, I mean, what will be interesting, I mean, first of all, it has to be noted that the role of the European Parliament in foreign policy is not huge. So in that respect, that's a realm that is still closer to member states and the sort of more intergovernmental realm of the Council. So in that respect, the immediate impact of the European parliamentary elections onto foreign policy has to be mediated by the fact that their role is a bit more limited than to, say, environmental legislation or other elements of the single market. I would, at the same time, I think what is very important is that you generally have a shift towards security, and security both in the political sense, defense, but also in the economic sense. So I would expect that the interplay between the Union and the globe, the questions of how to propping up defense, will be taking a more prominent role. And so in that respect, I think that will be a lens and a political frame that will be gaining more support. The other interesting element within the sort of further shift to the right is the question of protectionism. So to what extent, partly also reflecting, and I guess that's the question that David will be looking at in terms of EV and China, just reflecting the fact that we will have much more sort of more strained relations, and the relevance of WTO and international organizations has been gradually going down. So some of us reflecting of that, but also reflecting a sort of a shift towards a more populist stance, which makes issues of economic sort of free trade agreements and so on much more difficult to get through, and their parliament also plays a role. Now, briefly on the issue of legitimization, of course, I mean, I think personally that sort of a stronger politicization of European policy choices is useful, and from that perspective, I would have hoped that we would have had a much more intense debate in the European parliamentary elections. It took quite a while to take off. It was dominated still also by some of the national politicians, which in a way you can say it's good because the national politicians also have a European head on, but still it smelled and felt more like that this was done because people wanted to check their national popularity rather than focus on European issues. So in that respect, I would say I would hope that we would have actually more of a debate on the European, would have had more of a debate on European issues than what we had. One last point on this issue of the Spitzenkandidat. Here, there's a lot of people that roll their eyes and say, okay, with von der Leyen, first time round, this is over. I'm a little bit more positive on that, even if von der Leyen was not running as the lead candidate to get a seat in the parliament. I think the fact that she was the lead candidate for the EPP and that also the SD had a lead candidate with Nicolas Schmidt still kept that principle alive, and it would be something that could be picked up next time.
Thanks. So, David, I'll turn to you in just a second for any reflections you've got on the EV question, which feels to me like an interesting one, not just in its own merits, but also about that balance between protection, competitiveness, China, Europe, and so on. And then a heads up, we'll then have time for a very last round. And actually, I think, but really short answers, and that will be about implications for the United Kingdom of all of this. So a little heads up on that. But David, over to yourself.
If you'll excuse me just 1 second. I've got...
Not to worry. See,
okay,
what
Apologies. Okay. I think that competitiveness is probably a good issue for the next commission. Defense and competitiveness will be two areas where Mrs. von der Leyen should be able to get most of the member states, if not all the member states, behind her. I am not an expert on electric vehicles, but if I remember, well, two little facts is that the European Parliament supported fairly enthusiastically the Green Deal, and it was as part of the Green Deal that new sales of combustion engine vehicles were to be banned by 2035. And that obviously favored electric vehicles. And then last week there was this 38% tariff decided. So Chinese are up in arms. German car industry presumably relatively pleased, but we'll see how that develops. I would just like to add one other point, and that is we haven't talked about values. Now, this might be a slightly old-fashioned concept, but I was kind of brought up in my career in the EU institutions to consider that EU values of democracy, rule of law, but also tolerance and respect for diversity was at the core of the European project. And I'm not sure if that, I'm concerned that that aspect of being a member state of the European Union has not been somewhat forgotten. And I would hope that we will consider the various developments that we will see over the next few weeks and months with the next French government. That should be part and parcel of the verdict that we may come to on whether or not Europe can profit from this new development in France.
Thank you. That's really helpful. We've got just, I think, 2 minutes left, but it's time for one very last question. It was in the chat, but it's a super note on which to end. It's not impossible that there will be a change of government in the United Kingdom. The possible future Labour government has set out some substantive, if relatively thin, suggestions about future relationships. What would be your 30 seconds sort of takeaway for a new Europe minister or foreign secretary in that government? Johannes, start with you, then we'll turn to David, then give Sofia the last word.
No, I would advise, and that's not completely surprising, I suppose, to focus really on defense and security cooperation. The cooperation and the kind of interaction between NATO and EU on these issues will be extremely important. And here the UK has a strong voice and a strong role to play. And on top of that, it's an area that even within the EU is less institutionalized. So it's in flux, it's more fluid. So for a UK government, there would be more of a possibility to shape that role That's very different to, say, the single market, where this is highly institutionalized. There is no possibility to have a bespoke special deal, or not so easily. So I think I would focus on that, and then would be curious how this then pans out. In particular, last point, in particular, if there were to be a vote in November for Trump 2.0, the second term of Trump, which would really reinforce the need to have a European cooperation, or stronger European cooperation.
Thanks, Johannes. David, 30 seconds with David Lammy in the lift. What are you saying?
I would say yes, defense and security, but in the widest possible sense, that defense and security must cover energy, climate change, and many other things. And final word, what an irony that in a couple of weeks' time, the British government will be the only centre-left government not in coalition or not facing a far-right party in Europe.
Thank you. Irony indeed. Sofia, your 30 seconds. Let's give you Keir Starmer in the lift.
I'm not sure, actually. I would say, I think, kind of echoing what has already been said, it's actually, again, Britain doing something completely different to the rest of the continent, because it's probably the only country with potentially a left-wing government in the next few months. They'll say, okay, look, we've done it differently for you. But I think for me, I would also want to say something kind of building on what was said, rights, political rights, civil rights, human rights, and so on. We shouldn't really be losing sight of this. And what we're sensing in Europe and in the UK is that criticisms of those rights are becoming a little bit more mainstreamized in our rhetoric. And I would welcome them to actually provide an alternative point of view, where they actually really put them at the front and center of their agenda, and they actually try to embed rights more in our societies.
Thank you. Thank you. Really, really helpful. And that was actually a very positive note. Unexpectedly, when you talk to UK, talk about UK-EU relations, that's not normally the positive on which you end, but it was very positive. Terrific discussion, really wide-ranging, really well-informed. Thank you so much to those who joined and asked questions. I think this shows the very best, actually, of how some of these punchy online discussions can be. Really grateful to the Foreign Policy Centre for working with us to set this up. It's been fantastic. Especially grateful to Johannes, David, and Sofia for giving so generously of your time and wisdom, and look forward to future such occasions. If you're not on the Foreign Policy Centre mailing list, do be on it, because it's a very good place to be. And with that, we'll wrap it up and wish everyone a lovely rest of the day, onwards and upwards. And thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Goodbye, everybody.